Now, as I say, I'm the same person I was last time, including that I am once again plagiarizing from my second term course here at the college with the justifications, first of all, that you want to know what happens at the college, and in the second place, that if I didn't think it were true and important, I wouldn't say it to you or to them. And again, I'm mindful of the McLuhan quotation, especially because my notes for this one take up 130 pages of incoherent ramblings, which is very appropriate to the postmodernism theme. And it gets us back to that question: if things were going so well on Monday, also known as 1911 or 1895, how did they go so badly wrong? What kind of mix of improbable and inexorable are we looking at here? And of course, as always, what, if anything, can we do about it if we are able to understand it? And again, remember that thing about the foretaste of eternity. As you know, C.S. Lewis played around a bit with this idea in the Perilander trilogy in particular, that there's a kind of disintegration of personality in hell. And that what we sort of these Sufis who want to become one with everything, he says, what good men dream of in this life, the bad may actually get in the next world. And of course, many people, including unfortunately us, have sort of gotten it in this world because of the incoherence that has descended upon us with respect to deconstructionism. That the promised land that we seem to be approaching in 1913 is already in some trouble by 1919. But as the turbulent 20th century goes on with some triumphs and some tragedies, it becomes less and less probable that we really are on a smooth and inevitable journey toward the end of history. Never mind Francis Fukuyama claiming it had arrived in 1989. Obviously, he was misinformed. And again, my thesis here is that the problem that it manifests in the last 100 or so years didn't start there. That the problems go a lot further back, that the roots of all this trouble are much deeper. And also, because I'm very much an ideas matter person, I am persuaded that we are in the grip of ideas that, though they are wrong, are not trivial. They are not just foolishness. They're something much worse than that. And in some sense, they are, in fact, foolish. But they have a tremendous logic behind them, and they must be taken seriously as ideas, and they must be defeated in absolutely vigorous brain-to-brain combat, or we're never going to get out of this mess. And again, obviously the First World War is part of the problem here, and if this were the course, the next lecture would be on the First World War and all the ways in which it made life miserable, and undermined our sense that history had any meaning at all. Since this is not the course, I just recommend that in your spare time you watch my documentary. And again, my failed efforts somehow to find an angle here to make improper use of this conference for personal gain. The documentary is available free on my website, so that's not working out too well. And if this were the course, I would also say what I say to the students round about this point, that it's like a box of chocolates, that you never know what you're going to get. But as with those variety chocolates where you're hoping for a strawberry cream and instead you get a Brazil nut, many of the things that you bite into are quite displeasing, and you're thinking, who put this in the box? And so there are many nasty surprises in my course, nougat or worse, and this one is the worst of them all. If it were the course, you'd also get my identify and explain terms. And so the students are told, I put these up in every lecture, and you have to take their signposts in the fog, and I expect them on the exam to be able to give me 2 sentences, not more, what it is, 2 sentences, why it matters. You don't have to do that, there will not be a test, but these will periodically come up. And as you see, it's a bit of a strange progression, and not a very cheerful one, even on the theory that you like reading John Locke. And since in my version of the second treatise that I make the students read, he spells the word choose, C-H-U-S-E. How do you not love that? But to peek at the back of the book, we find ourselves at the time when we need truth more than ever playing Pontius Pilate, that we are mocking the very notion of truth, or at least a lot of people are, and this is getting us into a heap of trouble. And again, you know what I say, if you've read the Paralander trilogy, and it's always so nice to be here and think, and you probably have, right? Normally that's not a good start to an anecdote. But there's the scene in that hideous strength when it dawns on John Wither that the demons have miscalculated and their plans are all crumbling. But Lewis writes, it's incredible how little this knowledge moved him. It could not, because it had long since ceased to believe in knowledge itself. What had been in his far-off youth merely an aesthetic repugnance to realities that were crude or vulgar had deepened and darkened year after year into a fixed refusal of everything that was in any degree other than himself. He had passed from Hegel into Hume, thence through pragmatism, and thence through logical positivism, and out at last into the complete void. The indicative mood now corresponded to no thought that his mind could entertain. And obviously, if this happens to you, as Philip K. Dick once said, you're in big trouble. And it's funny because in my youth, I did read the logical positivists, and I found them very helpful, but I seem to have taken a different route than John Wither, mercifully. And when you look at the 20th century, again, this problem of things being hard to see because they're so familiar, we somehow got from, say, if you go look at Britain, from the sort of bourgeois virtues of Margaret Thatcher to the lascivious libertinism of Boris Johnson. And the US, we went from the corniness of Ronald Reagan to the surrealism of Donald Trump, and then out into the void in a space of 3.5 decades. That was fast. You would have thought that this sort of moral collapse would at least take 2 generations, but it didn't. And those are the conservatives, right? Just look on the other side, and you think to yourself, but is it not odd that this should have happened so quickly and with so little effective resistance? As poor Bob Dole asked in 1996, where's the outrage? A fine question. So how did we get here? And as usual, we got here on the ideas train. And one of the things that is curious about my starting with Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, other than you brought your pillows, right? The fact that they were, in some sense, not lively writers of prose, is that they seem like very staid, tame, and traditional kinds of people. They've got their frock coats and they've got their wigs. And you don't associate that with radicalism, especially if you have what Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. called a one-story intellect. But my thesis, of course, is that the radicalism that we're seeing in the 21st century has its roots in the 18th century and even earlier, and that the kind of thinking that these men were doing was was dangerous, and it was dangerous because it was compelling. Although I think it was wrong, it made a lot of sense and it carried a lot of people with it. And ideas have consequences. Again, there's somebody I never heard of in any other context. It's a Canadian professor, but he once said that people have small ideas, but big ideas have people. And this is a case where that has happened. And so I think it was never possible to avoid the West, the mind of the West, turning more and more to the question not of what we know, but of how we know things, and whether indeed we can know anything. And the West never flinches from tough questions, right? You weren't going to avoid this serious inquiry, and when you got onto it, you were going to go to some very dangerous places because that's where the ideas go. I don't say they necessarily abandon us there, but I say, again, be ready, gird yourselves for a battle. And by the way, I don't know if anybody here, having heard the expression to gird your loins, has ever wondered what on earth that was about. You know what girding your loins is? It's because, back in the day, they would wear basically a robe and a belt or girdle, and they didn't wear anything else. That's why you couldn't have steps going up to the tabernacle. And so when you know that the trouble is coming, you tuck the robe through your legs, pull it up at the back and into the girdle. And then you're ready for anything because you're not going to trip over your robe in the midst of this combat. So now when you gird your loins, you'll know the procedure. You're welcome. And see, one of the problems with the ideas that we follow into the 20th century is that you can't just not follow the logic, even if it takes you somewhere you don't want to be. For instance, Hitler's will to power. Despite the Nazis having certain atavistic cultural reflexes, they're actually very, very modern in their thinking. Sartre's nihilism, Foucault's decadence. Because, of course, one of the things that some people have noticed is that some things feel good even if you don't believe in them, right? And I could mention eating, or I could mention something else, but we'll go with eating. And you also can collapse into anime spiced with trivia about Kim Kardashian. Unfortunately, that's not Kim Kardashian. That's because I felt that my students should get some explanation of why I have this slide in the background. And this seems to me to be in three quick cartoons where we've ended up. And if I'm right about this, of course, one of the consequences that is important to understand and dwell on, I got this pitch from Mercatornet, which is sadly now folded. They just got tired and I think ran out of money. So give to the college and me. Together we can turn the tide as forces from without seek to dismantle Western civilization as we know it. But with all due respect to Michael, that's not the problem. The problem is the forces from inside that are seeking to dismantle Western civilization. In point of fact, our enemies are a feeble as well as a scurvy bunch. Nobody with any self-respect is going to get knocked off by Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and certainly not by Hamas. But we may manage to create a situation in which, with our help, they finish us off because we did it to ourselves. So again, what's this all about? I remember back in September of 2020, Terence Corcoran, who's an excellent writer for the National Post, has been one of the gems on the Canadian journalistic scene for a very long time, wrote a piece asking how all these gains from the Enlightenment could have been under such relentless assault given how well they had worked. Basically, Terry was saying we had it all figured out in the 18th century, proved it in the 19th century, and then we set it on fire in the 20th. And so I sent him a note and said, possibly the problem goes back to the Middle Ages. And he said, I'll leave it to you to work that out. And I said, thank you, that's what I'll do, and here I am. And again, this is where I start my religious war, because I show up in medieval garb and quote William James, who at one point said, if God is omniscient and omnipotent, we are puppets. There is nothing that we can do to change the course of destiny, which his will has from the beginning delineated and decreed. Calvinism and fatalism are the logical corollaries of such a definition. The same test applied to mechanistic determinism issues in the same results. If we really believed in determinism, we would become Hindu mystics and abandon ourselves at once to the immense vitality which uses us as marionettes. And then he says, of course, we do not accept these somber philosophies. The human intellect repeatedly proposes them because of their logical simplicity and symmetry, but life ignores them and overflows them and passes on. Wanna bet? You can't do that, right? You can't just say, I'm not going to think something because I don't like it. It doesn't work that way. So he's right about the problem to some degree, although again, he says, if we really believe, if we believed in determinism, we would do X. Well, if we believed in determinism and it were true, we wouldn't decide what to do. It would just be predetermined. We might do almost anything, including say that your actions have no bearing on your salvation and then wage religious wars on people who don't do it exactly the way we think they should. This goes back to ancient Greece. Zeno, who apparently did not believe in slavery, was beating a slave for some offense. And so his slave said, hey, by your own philosophy, I was predetermined from the beginning to commit that offense. And Zeno replied calmly, I was destined to beat you for it. Which I suppose is true, although that assumes we're predestined to be halfway logical, and there's no even reason why we should do that. But it does give us this problem. The mind having turned upon itself and apparently devoured itself, has it done so successfully, leaving only random attitudes? Or is there a light shining somewhere other than the Frankenstein place? And this is the point where I wonder whether some of my cultural references are not as successful in this group as the Paralandra one. That's from the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And I think you should know what both sides are thinking, but it doesn't mean you should necessarily watch it. As I mentioned, from my background being a little different perhaps than some of you, I saw it live in London in 1977. So there you are. But as Neil Postman, again, he wrote this book, Building a Bridge to the 18th Century. Postman said, in the 18th century, we had everything wired, everything was great, it worked, what the heck went wrong? But then he said, in a kind of a panic, What self-understanding is there to find in the 20th century, given Freud's insistence that reason is merely a servant of the genitalia? And if you're wondering how they got in there, well, it's amazing how when people stop believing in things, they take their clothes off. It's quite a consistent pattern, or at least they talk dirty. But again, he has a solid philosophical point as well. If you accept materialism as a philosophy in almost any form, you wind up being driven to the conclusion that the brain is not a rational organ with access, imperfect but nevertheless real, to truth. It is instead something that is being programmed in strange ways by something you can't get at for strange reasons. They don't have to be quite as strange as Sigmund Freud's, but they're going to be just as pernicious from the point of view of trying to make sense, have free will, or do anything that actually has moral or even intellectual logic. You know, and C.S. Lewis talks about this, what Philip K. Dick calls the divine invasion. Lewis talks about the way in which something intrudes into our minds, giving us absolute standards that enable us to do something with our thoughts other than compare them to their own defective selves. And something like that has to be happening, or we really are done in. But the thing that we need to be rescued from doesn't have to be Freud and these dark sexual impulses. It can be Marx and everything that we do being an expression of our socioeconomic situation. It could be Charles Darwin and the forces of evolution, deciding what you're going to think and why and how, and creating altruism as an adaptive mechanism, not as an expression of moral truth. Or again, I say in my religious war mode, you can be a Calvinist and God did it, but you're just as stuck. We'll pass on that. But in so many ways, you find yourself thinking, if I only had a brain, but you keep being told you don't. Daniel Boorstin, a sort of a naive passage in one of his books, says that in the US revolutionary age, men were inclined to take their opponents at their word. The revolutionary debate seems to have been carried on in the belief that men meant what they said. But in this age of Marx and Freud, we have begun to take it for granted that if people talk about one thing, they must be thinking about something else. And then he says, ideas are treated as the apparatus of an intellectual sleight of hand, by which the speaker diverts the audience's attention to an irrelevant subject while he does the real business unobserved. But again, that paints too rosy a picture, despite being so grim, because in the modern understanding, a la Marx and Freud and so on, the speaker's diverting their own attention as well, or rather, they haven't got an attention to be diverted. Nobody has access to what's really going on. We're all just being driven by these mechanical forces that have programmed our brains. And we are, the ghost in the machine. We are sitting there watching thoughts flicker across the screen in our heads, thinking we're having them, but we're not. They're just being inflicted on us, and why we're there helplessly is never really adequately explained, but there we are. In fact, again, Marshall McLuhan, as I said, Marshall McLuhan wasn't given to thigh slappers. This was not a joke. But he said about Freud in particular, it is often said that the major development of this century has been the discovery of the night world of dreams. By day, we are the bottom half of a double boiler. We are all steamed up, but we don't know what's cooking. And again, as opposed to, okay, that is actually kind of funny. Lewis has this line in Mere Christianity. He said, when he was young, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? And that is, there's your light at the end of the tunnel. So we'll keep focusing on that as things get darker and we speed up and the roar gets louder. But Ludwig Wittgenstein, when he talked about how do we know our memory is reliable, he said, well, so one way is to compare a memory with other memories. But he said, that's no good. That's like a man who buys several copies of the morning paper in order to assure himself that what it says is true. And again, if you've ever dealt with somebody who's suffering mental illness, you understand the nightmares. Walter Bagehot said, all other afflictions in life are a joke compared to mental illness. Because if you can't trust your thoughts, how can you trust the brain and the thoughts of your brain about the problems of the defects in your thought. And again, I mentioned Philip K. Dick periodically, and he's apparently a science fiction writer, but really he's an epistemological philosopher. And this is the big question that preoccupied him. How does a flawed mind identify and correct its own flaws? And that is the problem that a great many people have with good reason, and we must take it seriously. There was a piece in Chronicles in 1991 when my OCD was still just a fledgling, young, innocent OCD, and I didn't always write down authors, so I don't know who it was who said this. But he commented, when I look at the generation of my grandfather, roughly the generation after Freud, the generation that saw the First World War, what hits me is their robust self-confidence, their confidence in their goodwill we cannot even imagine. We distrust ourselves. And why wouldn't we? I mean, our performance would certainly justify a certain amount of distrust, but also the more we have thought about how we think, the more we have convinced ourselves that we don't do it well at all. So why would we trust ourselves? And again, then the final paradox here is, and why would we trust our reasoning about our own reasoning? So at this point, you've gone off the cliff, looked down, and this kind of thing, the theory of mass, man, all these things, is that people have something or other has detached them entirely from the process of thinking, if it ever existed. And in writing about Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells and Sigmund Freud back in Chesterton's time, Philip Yancey said, with furrowed brows and dark, haunted eyes, they would expostulate on their optimistic visions of the future, whereas Chesterton cheerfully defended original sin in the Last Judgment. And one of the things that you do see in the moderns is a lot of whistling past the graveyard. And again, Erich Fromm, who was kind of the Buddhism meets the 1960s, and he wrote some sensible stuff, and he wrote very well also. But at one point he said, our understanding of the quality of knowing in the being mode of existence can be enhanced by the insights of such thinkers as the Buddha, the Hebrew prophets, Jesus, Master Eckhart, Sigmund Freud, and Karl Marx. And I read this as such thinkers as, would you like to tell me what category that was? Books someone might have on their shelf. And of course, among other things, the enthusiasm with which the Kinsey report was greeted, despite the obvious methodological flaws of its and personal flaws of its author. But it nevertheless has given us things like, you all saw this, I'm sure, the first man on the cover of Vogue wearing a dress, and Harry Styles makes his own rules. And everybody makes their own rules these days, like who among us isn't a rebel? The problem, of course, is that if there are no rules, when you make your own, it doesn't work, right? You have no rules. And they mean nothing. They don't come from anywhere. You have no idea which they should be or when to observe or break them. You're just completely lost, and frankly, you look it. Anyway, if you read that article, you'd know we were in a lot of trouble, which we obviously are. And as you may know, Whittaker Chambers at one point said to William F. Buckley Jr. that it's idle to talk about preventing the wreck of Western civilization. It's already a wreck from within. That is why we can hope to do little more now than snatch a fingernail of a saint from the rack or a handful of ashes from the faggots and bury them secretly in a flower pot against the day, ages hence, when a few men begin again to dare to believe that there was once something else, that something else is thinkable and needs some evidence of what it was. Well, for all my admiration for Whittaker Chambers, he was a bit of a gloomy chap. I think we are already those people, and we are going to do this. But we are going to do it in a world of grievance studies and all kinds of things that certainly underline that the West has lost faith in itself, not in some small way, not because it stubbed its toe at the Somme, but in a way that is very, very deep and fundamental. Somebody was trying to get me to be interested in Genghis Khan and the making of the modern world, and saying that in every country the Mongols conquered, they brought an unprecedented rise in cultural communication, expanded trade, and a blossoming of civilization, vastly more progressive than his European or Asian counterparts, blah, 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 blah. Really? I mean, it's a free country. Anybody can express an opinion, however goofy. But in a world where we would think Genghis Khan was a good ruler, and that Magna Carta was a fraud, something is very wrong. And one of the problems here, and even in teaching students at Augustine College, who obviously have one foot on the rock of truth, I still have to watch out for the other one being on the sand. And I quote a number of things to them right at the beginning of the course about the prevalence of relativism. Moral relativism, of course, coming from intellectual relativism. The idea that we cannot know anything is the reason why people think we cannot know what is good. And so I cite, it's just the 10th edition of a standard survey of American history that was current when I was in graduate school, and one of the authors was on the faculty. And the whole book starts, the past, of course, can never change, but our understanding of the past changes constantly. And you think, oh, there's an open-minded, curious, flexible thinker. But if our understanding of the past changes constantly, why would you read a book on history? Because that was our understanding. Oh, it changed. Oh, it's changed again. Well, I think this, you think that. Oh, it's changed again. Right? There's nothing to hold on to. There's just chaos. And yet, a book on art history. Each generation interprets the past, including art, according to its own needs. There is no truly objective history, only our interpretation. Well, then why go to an art gallery? Right? There is no Mona Lisa. There's only my interpretation, which isn't of any interest to you, because yours, which will, of course, change constantly, is different than mine. It's not founded on anything, and some fool will tape a banana to a wall. I promise. Or the Atlantic Daily sent me this email. Why no singer has replaced Lady Gaga? And I thought to myself with pride, I wouldn't recognize a song by this person or a photograph of them. I didn't think they needed replacing. I didn't know they'd gone away, but if they have, thank goodness, that's one less noise in the world. But it turns out that the artist, apparently his thesis was that there's no new superstar singer as thrillingly meaningless as Lady Gaga. Imagine meaningless as a selling point. It's like, hey, I'm going to give a lecture that will be meaningless. You're like, I'm not going to that. And it goes on and on and on, including, I remember fairly recently, recently these days means long ago, Bob Plamondon wrote a book, The Truth About Trudeau, and this was about Trudeau Sr. And I remember reading this book was an ordeal because it reminded me of all the things that had been wrong with Trudeau Sr., many of which I had blissfully forgotten. But anyway, he gave him the knucklebone shampoo and didn't leave much when he was done. And then Andrew Cohen, who was a professor, I think at Carleton, and a columnist and a reputable sage, was saying, yeah, well, whatever. As friends, we've agreed to disagree. The book is called The Truth About Trudeau. As students of history know, though, there is usually more than one truth. Ultimately, Plamondon has his Trudeau and I have mine. And among other things, I didn't like this because it meant there were lots of him, and I thought one was quite bad enough. But again, you see, this complete collapse of thought by somebody who doesn't realize his thought is completely collapsed, right? Do I get to have a Trudeau who was a 14th century minstrel? Does someone else get to have one who was a general in the SS? What do you even think you're talking about? Well, but he's got his truth and I have mine. So, and there was a controversy about this Flamin' Hot Cheetos story because some guy claimed to have invented them, and perhaps he was making a big fuss about it because he was an identity politics guy, and then it turned out he hadn't. But they were like, yeah, whatever. We're not in the documentary business. So, in fact, they were just like, yeah, we lied, but what's that to you? Or we made it all up, but everything's made up anyway. This is just everywhere. On Maclean's power list for 2023, Gabor Mate for mainstreaming the notion that there's no such thing as normal. So now they can write, it's normal to think there's no such thing as normal, thanks to a guy who normalized it. And nobody in the editorial department says, wait a minute. This is how everybody, well, perhaps thinks is too strong a word. And then I remember there was this fluffy 12 things successful women do differently on the Huffington Post that said, every woman has her own definition of success. So, I don't know, face down in the gutter, intoxicated on cheap tequila might be yours. But then it says, but there are certain traits that most successful women share, presumably including not being face down in the gutter. So, I mean, in some sense, everybody knows this is not true, but at the same time, it's got you. Even Rousseau defined history as the art of choosing from among many lies that one which most resembles the truth. Though cynical, is not nihilistic, because it implies that they do resemble the truth, and there's a truth that can indeed be resembled. And, I've done this. I remember once I was debating a then famous Canadian feminist who'd called sexual assault inappropriate. And I implied that this was an inadequate word, and I said, why don't you call it wrong? You'll feel better. And she said, no, I won't. And she had her inappropriate and I had mine. But I thought when you get to the point where a feminist won't call rape wrong, something has taken possession of your mind, and it's something that you shouldn't have allowed to do so. Likewise, when Prince Harry wrote a book that was full of inaccuracy and said, oh, well, it doesn't matter in a memoir. So back to Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, a desperate attempt to retreat to solid ground, which will fail. They're sort of everywhere, and I managed to find this place where someone to put the three of them together. And as I say, I did read these guys as an undergraduate, and it really was a soporific experience. Despite the hilarious jibe, David Hume said that there was no such thing as ideas, and Berkeley said there was no such thing as matter. And someone summed up their debate as no matter, never mind. But who are these guys? You wouldn't think they could possibly be dangerous. But, take Locke, who we deal with in the course as a brilliant theorist of liberty. And when it comes to constitutionalism, I am a Lockean through and through. But Locke is also the guy who says that the mind is a tabula rasa. But if your mind is a blank slate, I don't mean occasionally, I mean this is your default condition, how would you ever put anything on it? How would you ever start? And then Kant, of course, says, oh, no, we have innate ideas. But if he's right that we have innate ideas, how would you ever check them against anything except themselves, right? You're like Wittgenstein's guy with 6 copies of the newspaper. How would you get anywhere near any kind of truth? And indeed, Hume says there are no ideas. All we have is sensory impressions. And for some reason, we believe in cause and effect, but we have no logical ground for doing so. And if you actually take that seriously, you're done. You will never think again. How could you? And you see what's going on here. We're no longer philosophizing about the world. We're philosophizing about philosophizing. It's like a relationship where all you talk about is us. You're in a heap of trouble again. And as somebody who is otherwise unremarkable wrote, for philosophy is and always has been devoted to one and only one question. What are we talking about, if indeed we are talking about anything? And that, of course, is completely wrong. Socrates was talking about justice. Augustine was talking about God. And in fact, a rather unsuccessful book, in my opinion, called The Atheist Syndrome, he said, since men and women first began to think, they have always asked themselves 3 questions more important than all others. Is the universe ruled by law or by chance? What is the right way to live? Where do we go when we die? And indeed, that is what philosophy was about for the first couple of 1,000 years, but it isn't anymore. And there's a phrase from former American Senator Malcolm Wallop, who once wrote, essential questions thrown out through the front door often climb back in through the window. But of course, we've stopped believing there is a window or a door or questions or ideas. And of course, there's always been pushback against it. Remember Samuel Johnson trying to get rid of this whole Hume Berkeley rubbish by kicking a rock and saying, there, rock. Or there was a Pickles cartoon from 2001 where he says to his grandson, today, Nelson, we're going to study philosophy. Let's start by asking ourselves the question, do we really exist? Can you feel your underwear? Me too. And that is how we know that we really do exist. So, in one sense, having, as I say, passed through logical positivism in my youth, I'm tempted to say that Berkeley and Hume were arguing about nothing. But how can you not? And indeed, the irony, one of the reasons I didn't like that book on atheism is that the author psychoanalyzes atheists instead of arguing with them. So he says that their ideas come from some irrational source, which is exactly the problem with the whole modern world, is this is what we think, that ideas come from an irrational source. And again, you look at people like Herbert Spencer, right, who comes up with a very Darwinian account of ethics and tries to get rid of religion and bring in laissez-faire and get rid of the nascent welfare state. But he said the supposed supernatural sanctions of right conduct do not, if rejected, leave a blank. There exist natural sanctions no less peremptory and covering a much wider field. Acceptance of the doctrine of organic evolution determines certain ethical conceptions. Want to bet? As Santayana said, the real problem of philosophy is to devise a means whereby men may be persuaded to virtue without the stimulus of supernatural hopes and fears. But that's not going to get it done. Oops, sorry. You can't do this stuff just by wishing. So here we go. I always think it's funny. I once read a book about Stalin as a young revolutionary with a picture of Stalin as a young man, and I was stunned at the thought that he had ever not had gray hair and that mustache and a huge pile of bodies. Now you recognize that kid, right? He is Charles Darwin, and here's Charles Darwin as some of his enemies saw him. And as I mentioned on Monday, Darwin is a great Englishman, and he is buried in Westminster Abbey, but unfortunately he has been eroding the foundations ever since. Because Darwin's theory is that things work because they work. Nothing succeeds like success. Might makes right. And if that's true, if you really take that seriously, then a bad idea that passes on its genes will defeat a good idea that is less adapted to survival in this ruthless struggle. And so you're going to wind up with your mental processes come from the genes that had more kids that lived to reproduce than the genes that didn't, not the ones that saw things correctly. So no matter how strongly your brain requires you to believe your ideas, you have no reason to believe them. All you know is it's a trick of the genes, and that your genes hope that you will have 10,000 great-great-great-great-grandchildren. They don't care about anything else, and you're not allowed to care about anything else. They're not going to let things distract you. And so, as you know, the sociobiologist said, what about altruism? But that helps your genes to survive. And don't forget, you share genes with your siblings and your cousins in diminishing amounts. So if you heroically give your life childless, or when a Darwin would, you still help your genes reproduce because you help your tribe to flourish, and your tribe is carrying the same genes you are. And so you think you should be heroic and courageous and honest because these are good things, but that's not what's going on. Nature just wants more DNA, right? The chicken being the egg's way of making more eggs. And as Laplace said in 1814, a mind that in a given instance knew all the forces by which nature is animated and the position of all the bodies of which it is composed, if it were vast enough to include all these data within its analysis, could embrace in one single formula the movements of the largest bodies of the universe and the smallest atoms. Nothing would be uncertain for him. The future and the past would be equally before his eyes. And that includes, of course, not just what I am going to say here, and when I may cough or stumble or lose my train of thought, but also your reaction. All of this was predetermined by the movement and velocity and direction of the particles at the time of the Big Bang. Because what's going on in here is this electrochemical activity, which is driven by the general state of your body, and that's why you think what you think. You don't think what you think because you are intelligent and have the free will capacity to evaluate ideas. You're just acting out a program. And again, in this sense, of course, you're not really here. And thus, the more honest amongst the Darwinians and the neo-Darwinians say there is no such thing as ethics. And Robert Wright, who wrote The Moral Animal, said, think of it, zillions and zillions of organisms running about, each under the hypnotic spell of a single truth. All these truths identical and all logically incompatible with one another. My hereditary material is the most important material on Earth. Its survival justifies your frustration, pain, even death. And you are one of these organisms, living your life in the thrall of a logical absurdity. And that is a logical consequence of the Darwinian theory. Darwin said he who understands baboons would do more toward metaphysics than Locke. And again, unless somebody else wrote, this is J. Budziszewski, unless deep conscience has been designed to impart moral knowledge, there is no particular reason to think that it does impart moral knowledge. It is just a piece of driftwood cast upon the shore of the human intellect by the eddies of natural selection. And so when people embrace Darwin because he said some things that I think are clever and plausible about the nature of finches. They buy an idea that will abolish thought and abolish man unless you can find some drastic way to put the brakes on part way through. And another confirmed Darwinian, a professor and historian of biology, William Provine, says there is no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, and no free will. But don't get mad, he had to say it. There was no free will. That thought was predestined from the Big Bang. And this is this thing that C.S. Lewis talks about, the poem by Hughes Mearns. As I was walking up the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd stay away. And Lewis has talked about debating a materialist and saying, how do you argue with a man who insists that he's not there? And that's what he was talking about, this guy's insistence that there is no ghost inside the machine, that he is just a bunch of pre-programmed responses. And this, of course, again, turns up. This is what happens to Augustus Frost in that hideous strength, and it does him in very, very badly. And again, as I pointed out, there's a sense in which all this is silly, and of course, Chesterton nailed it right as it was getting started. I deny that biology can destroy the sense of truth, which alone can even desire biology. No truth which I can find can deny that I am seeking the truth. My mind cannot find anything which denies my mind. But, and in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, at one point, Zaphod Beeblebrox wants them to take out Arthur's brain and grind it up so the mice can experiment on it. And he says nobody would miss it. And of course, Arthur says, I'd miss it. And Zaphod says, no, you'd be programmed not to. And in a way, that encapsulates it all. And of course, life being like golf, it's never so bad it can't get worse. It does get worse. You get Karl Marx. And Richard John Neuhaus called these guys the three masters of suspicion, Marx, Freud, and Darwin. Because Marx creates almost exactly the same problems as Darwin, except in Marx's case, it's socioeconomic structure, not genetic structure. And then Sigmund Freud creates the same problems again, except this case, it's sexual desire so dark that you'd be lunging for the soap to wash my mouth out if I reminded you of what exactly he thought was going on. When he said everything was relative, he didn't mean it the way Einstein did. Now, speaking of Einstein, who's this guy? Looks like somebody I used to work with. Charlie Chaplin? Groucho Marx? No, it's Albert Einstein. And again, Einstein gets a bum rap here, because Paul Johnson, in his History of the 20th Century, he begins Modern Times by saying that confirmation of some of Einstein's theories by observation convinced everybody that everything was relative. And this, of course, is not what Einstein said at all. He said that there was these four-dimensional calculations that gave you one and only one answer. They were just a bit different than Newtonian ones, especially if stuff was going really, really, really fast. But popular culture doesn't always get it right. And it's also not completely new. Voltaire once said, as a toad, what is beauty? A female with two great round eyes coming out of her little head, a large flat mouth, a yellow belly, and a brown back. Or even Macaulay once said, nothing is so useless as a general maxim. Yeah, it's a general maxim. Thank you for that. And again, it's been claimed again and again that who is it I've got here? Peter Kreeft saying universal doubt is psychologically impossible. No one can do it. For example, to choose to doubt is not to doubt that there's a difference between doubting and not doubting. And there we're just not just saying it's psychologically impossible, he's saying it's logically impossible, which is true and important and good. Even Epicurus, who let the atoms swerve so there could be free will, and he said, it would be better to follow the myths about the gods than to become a slave to the destiny of the natural philosophers. And I agree. The problem is, if people like Darwin or Marx or Freud convince you that rational thought is impossible, you've thought yourself into a state where you can't think rationally, which is going to make it hard to think your way out of it again. And you can't just say, well, I don't like it, so I won't believe it. Those guys, it was the Bridgeport theses, the arguments against Darwin, had far too much of that in them and far too little of there's something wrong with this. And again, C.S. Lewis sees this and he attacks it. Unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. It follows that no account of the universe can be true unless that account leaves it possible for our thinking to be a real insight. Thus, a strict materialism refutes itself for the reason given long ago by Professor Haldane. If my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. But this doesn't necessarily let you get back to what you'd rather think. This may just leave you convinced you can't think. And if you are convinced that you cannot think, then you have about 3 choices, really. You can collapse into anomie and die or get tattoos. You can succumb to hedonism, or you can, a la Hitler, decide to impose your will upon a world that contains no inherent order. And that's why I said that Hitler is very modern. And of course, Stalin, with his pseudo-scientific Marxism that actually amounts to this will to create a revolution where one should not have happened, is doing much the same thing. Which is why you get this weird situation in which the 2 most apparently hostile philosophies of the 20th century that do, in fact, go bloodily to war with one another are at bottom variants on one. It's why they hate one another so much, I think, is because they are, in fact, deep down, they are very much the same. And as you know, in Germany in the 20s, the communists and the Nazis had rules about who could join the party, but they would waive those rules for someone from the other totalitarian party. So they had some sense of this. And as I say, this is sort of everywhere now. I have a camera and my telephone. And so I saw this on this bus in Ottawa, this guy saying, defy definition. And some orange jumpsuited, I know not what, product of devolution. It's like, no, thanks. Or this, I just snap these everywhere. Defy the conventional, the campaign for you, Ottawa. Will you change the world? This is the face of change. I am a rebel. And these Hong Kong and Shanghai banking corporations never deposit a farthing with this bank until they stop running those ads, okay? Tomorrow will be nothing like today. Oh, really? So tomorrow things won't keep changing? But, of course, once you lose your mind, you haven't got a mind. Standards are meant to be broken. And I'm thinking, would that include your window? Okay, I didn't break their window. But honestly, it seems like the logical conclusion. Again, I talked about this in one of these previous conferences, that in their own way, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, and Conrad all warned against this. Dostoevsky, obviously, from a traditional point of view. Nietzsche, I think, is misunderstood. I think Nietzsche is regarded as an enthusiast for a world against which, in fact, he was warning with such horror that it drove him mad. And Conrad was trapped inside it. Conrad, in a letter to a friend, talked about the universe being this hideous machine that evolved itself out of a chaos, and it knits itself together, and it grinds people up, and you can't do anything to change it. The most withering thought is that this infamous thing has made itself without thought, without conscience, without foresight, without eyes, without heart. It is a tragic accident, and it has happened. You can't interfere with it. The last drop of bitterness is the suspicion that you can't even smash it. In virtue of that truth, one and immortal, which lurks in the force which made it spring into existence, it is what it is, and it is indestructible. It knits us in and it knits us out. It has knitted time, space, pain, death, corruption, despair, and all the illusions, and nothing matters. And so Conrad hated it, but he wasn't able just to wish it away. This was how he saw the world, and he couldn't find an intellectual exit from it. And again, it ties in with H.P. Lovecraft. And he has this line about the ancient legends of ultimate chaos, at whose center sprawls the blind idiot god Azathoth, lord of all things, encircled by his flopping horde of mindless and amorphous dancers, and lulled by the thin, monotonous piping of a demoniac flute held in nameless paws. And you see, Lovecraft was a master of despair, as well as obsessed with gambrel roofs and eldritch screams. And the idea, if you're looking for God and you never find him, you always think, maybe tomorrow I'll find God. But if you find him and he's useless, you're cooked. Which I think psychologically is why a lot of people in bad places in their lives don't turn to Christianity, because they think, if I don't try it, it's always there as a potential escape. But if I try it and it fails me, I've had it. But all of this, have I got 2 copies of this slide? Oh yes, Conrad in Heart of Darkness, when he's just talking about Kurtz after Kurtz has died. He had faith, don't you see? He had the faith. He could get himself to believe anything. He would have been a splendid leader of an extreme party. What party, I asked? Any party, answered the other. He was an extremist. And you see, he can get himself to believe anything because there is nothing out there that he is obliged to believe of its own accord, and he must believe something. Who is this man? Al. There he is. Right? You think that was such an exact description of Adolf Hitler. And, of course, and then Mussolini, who sort of farced Hitler's tragedy. But early on in his career, he said, the Democrats of Il Mondo want to know our program. It is to break the bones of the Democrats of Il Mondo, and the sooner the better. And you see, there's somebody who has embraced the absence of truth and decided to do something positive with it in the assertive sense, not in the good sense, that he will substitute his own will for any possibility of ultimate meaning. This is what all of this stuff is right. And again, I keep mentioning, I think that it's intellectually untenable. I think the refutations sit in plain sight. Philip K. Dick at one point says, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, it doesn't go away. And of course, that's the point about breaking people's bones, right? Suppose someone says there is no truth, and then you shoot them. They stop saying there's no truth, right? And Mussolini, in some odd way, intuited that. And things didn't go very well. But again, as I said, Nazism is about a triumph of the will, not a triumph of truth, something that you put into the void. And obviously, in some sense, like Satan's rebellion against God, this is a pathetic enterprise from the beginning. But it's an understandable one. You can't think your way back to thought, so instead you just decide to impose it through the strength of your character. And people like Sartre, trying to find meaning in nothingness, are engaged in a very similar enterprise, which is not irrational. But again, lifting yourself by your mental bootstraps is clearly, in some way, is something you should never even start. And this is Lenin. I cannot listen to music often. It affects my nerves. I want to say amiable stupidities and stroke the heads of the people who can create such beauty in a filthy hell. But today is not the time to stroke people's heads. Today hands descend to split skulls open, split them open ruthlessly. Though opposition to all violence is our ultimate ideal, it is a hellishly hard task. And obviously in practice, Lenin didn't find it hard. It was Molotov who at some point said compared to this, Lenin, Stalin was a lamb. But again, the Bolshevik program is very, very voluntarist. And again, if reality is that which, when you stop believing, doesn't go away. Obviously, Hitler's program failed, and we ended up making jokes about it. Because, as Chesterton said, the opposite of funny isn't serious, it's not funny. And this cartoon, which I show the students, and you may be familiar with it, and if you're not, you probably can't read it, but this is the Ribbentrop-Molotov or Hitler-Stalin pact, and that's Poland there on the ground. And Hitler is saying, the scum of the earth, I believe, and Stalin is saying, the bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. And this moment for a lot of people, when the realization came that Nazism and Bolshevism were so similar, and Whittaker Chambers has this story when he has met with a ex-NKVD general who has defected. And they're speaking in German because it's the only language they had in common. And he said, like most people who had a Marxist background, this guy would start a conversation with one big theoretical question that would settle everything. So after a long silence, Gravitsky says to him, is the Soviet government a fascist government? And Chambers pauses for a suitable length of time, and then he says, yeah, die Sowjetregierung ist eine Faschistenregierung. Yes, the Soviet government is a fascist government. And that is true metaphysically, not just politically. But also, again, assuming you have read 1984, you remember, with all the stuff about doublethink, there's this one big puzzle. Do party members believe or don't they? And finally, Winston Smith gets hold of Emmanuel Goldstein's book, and he's reading it, and it's all being explained. And he gets to, here we reach the central secret. As we've seen, the mystique of the party, and above all of the inner party, depends upon doublethink. But deeper than this lies the original motive, the never-questioned instinct that first led to the seizure of power and brought doublethink, the thought police, continuous warfare, and all the other necessary paraphernalia into existence afterwards. This motive really consists, and then he's interrupted, and he never gets back to the book. And so we should have never figured it out. And, sorry, I did have a slide about that. It's impossible to do this so that there isn't one slide that's not cute. Eric Hoffer, this eccentric longshoreman who wrote little maxims about totalitarianism, said faith in a holy cause is to a considerable extent a substitute for the lost faith in oneself. But again, that's a psychological explanation. And if we're going to psychoanalyze them and they're going to psychoanalyze us, their program will be to break our bones and with some justice. So we've got to somehow get back to this. And as Chesterton said, the naturalist must not destroy all my reverence for conscience on Monday and expect to find me still venerating it on Tuesday. And I also like this news story out of Russia. This was about 10 years ago. An argument over the theories of 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant ended in a man being shot in a grocery store in southern Russia. So again, Philip K. Dick's revenge, right? But again, we think about Camus and the myth of Sisyphus, where he's rolling the rock up the hill and then it keeps rolling down and he knows he'll never get it up there, but he finds meaning in continuing to roll it. No. Understandable, but no. Just getting nowhere. And you get so much of this. Just one line from Camus in The Myth of Sisyphus. At last man will find again there the wine of the absurd and the bread of indifference on which he feeds his greatness. And again, as I say, just not going to work. So all of this has landed us, I say, in a great deal of trouble, and I am very much aware of the time. But I have a few more things I'm gonna do anyway. I didn't start at 7, so I didn't have to stop at 8. But I won't torture you. And this is also from Neil Postman, staring in horror at the modern world. I refer to those who've fallen under the devilish spell of what is vaguely called postmodernism, and in particular a subdivision of it sometimes called deconstructionism. In this way of understanding things, language is under deep suspicion and is even thought to be delusional. Jean Baudrillard, a Frenchman of all things, tells us that not only does language falsely represent reality, but there is no reality to represent. Perhaps this explains at long last the indifferent French resistance to the German invasion of their country in World War II. They didn't believe it was real. It's a lovely put down, but probably isn't going to win the argument all by itself. But this is also why you get Le Corbusier writing vers une architecture. He doesn't write une architecture, just towards an architecture. It's like Sisyphus, rolling up the hill, never get there. Again, just so that you can have some light and joy in your life. But they really do, right? And when I get an invitation to a lecture about Webb's as a poetics of disruption, subversion, displacement, and resistance, she creates a pluralistic, decentered world, a world in which she participates but does not dominate. Her ideas on the poetic process are not to be found in any statements, however. She has refused to theorize about her own or anyone else's writings. And I didn't go, but people did. And apparently they thought this was a good way to spend their time, possibly for lack of alternatives. And again, you may know one of the problems for Paul Jacques Derrida was that he didn't oppose apartheid because he didn't believe anything was real. In a debate with him, Hans-Georg Gadamer, about Derrida saying understanding is an illusion, said, I must apologize to Monsieur Derrida for understanding him. I have understood what he has to say. But of course, it's also the case that someone like Michel Foucault, another famous deconstructionist, said that the Ayatollah Khomeini's goal was the introduction of a spiritual dimension into politics. And when instead Khomeini hanged his gay lover, he didn't seem particularly upset by it, better him than me, or something along those lines. But also, you may not know about Foucault that he was an active participant in the bathhouse culture. He had AIDS and he didn't tell people. So he killed a lot of people, but then again, since he believed that reality was an illusion, presumably so was HIV, and since he didn't believe in morality and he was having a good time, presumably it was all okay. So this is where you end up, but what are you meant to do about it? And again, I mentioned Republicans. Well, remember Bill Clinton and it depends on the meaning of is? Like from Lincoln to that, really? And what's amazing is that when he said that, his party rallied around him and so did the public. So that tells you what a problem we have. And then I thought at some point that this was a Philip K. Dick moment, that the planes crashing into the World Trade Center by people who were not relativists, I should add, had called people back to the question of whether there was reality, whether having planes full of innocent civilians, men, women, and children, crash into a building, killing other innocents might actually be a bad thing. And it looked as though we were going to get somewhere on that. But I don't know if we got very far on it. I mean, the demographic winter is still a problem, and obviously failure to have children and failure to believe in anything are closely connected. It is true, as those of you with kids know, that kids are not the world's greatest hedonistic project. They bring many sublime joys, but only to people who have something a little bit higher in mind. And I don't know if you, by the way, after the Americans, of course, went into Afghanistan after this terrorist attack, and the Dalai Lama praised them for how they were conducting the war. So did Nelson Mandela. When the Americans committed those offenses at Abu Ghraib, they immediately started firing people and investigating. There was this feeling, perhaps, that something was going on that was working, and that people were getting back to a sense that there was such a thing as evil in the world. And again, the United States being the last best hope of mankind, the place where liberty will triumph or perish. Liberty has been moving west from Greece to Rome to England to the United States, but there's nowhere else to go. And so this was an NBC News story, but why Germany has so much riding on the US election. And you could go to Germany and get a variety of opinions on Donald Trump, all negative. But if you were to go around the United States asking for opinions on the current president of Germany, you wouldn't get one person in 15 who could say their name, whether it is a man or a woman. I remember that Bob Newhart line about if you'd want to seem clever at a party, you can usually manage it by making a reference to Goethe, even if you have never read any of his or her works. But again, there was this kind of feeling that back to the wall here. But it didn't go as well as I would have hoped. There was a survey about, when would this have been? This was in 2018, that millennials, 22% of millennials said they hadn't heard of the Holocaust or weren't sure. Asked to identify Auschwitz, 41% of American adults as a whole, and 66% of millennials could not come up with a correct response, identifying it as a concentration camp in occupied Poland where 1.1 million people were killed. Just 5 to 6% knew Jews were killed in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Just 37% knew Jews from Poland were killed, Poland being the home to 3.5 million of the Jews killed in the Holocaust. So, but how could this not have, how does this not happen in the world? This is from the director of San Diego's Museum of Contemporary Art back in 1993. So this now, of course, is 30 years ago. With respect to the content of the work and whether we think it is a good artwork or a bad artwork, we really have no position on that. To which the obvious question is, well, I noticed that you have some artworks in your museum and you have other artworks that are not in your museum, including ones that were offered to you at some point. If you don't know good from bad art, what selection process do you use? As I say, the problem with that is that you might get this for an answer. Somebody taped a banana to a wall and called it art. Somebody else ate it and called it art. They put up another banana and called it art. And in the meantime, it just keeps getting worse, it seems like. Somebody actually bought it for $120,000. The guy who ate it only ate the banana. They didn't eat the duct tape. So again, there's presumably some sense of what's real and what's not. You get people doing the Virgin Mary and dung and that kind of thing. By the way, I came across this a couple of years ago. And I was looking at this and thinking, as someone whose hairstyle has not been featured in any fashion shoots, but the hair trends that will define 2021, my thought was not so much, well, did they actually? Like if you went back and compared what they said would define 2021 in the above the brow world with what really did, but it's like, is a good-looking hairstyle a chronological thing? I was thinking if it looked good on Cleopatra, it probably would look good today, and if it made her look silly, then you shouldn't do it. But people really have this idea, or you can get these flavor trends, right? There's these magazines that guess what flavors will be cool in the coming year. And I think, my question is, does it taste good or not? There's a thing I'm going to skip by here because I then complain to my students about how ugly architecture is, and then this is a slide of beautiful buildings, because the truth is that not everybody is a complete idiot, but not everybody wants to sit here for the next half hour either. So we will spare you that, and you could look it up if the guy who'd sent it to me give me any idea where it came from. But it'll probably start playing now, and I won't let it. But there are some good buildings. Though again, part of the thing that's odd is that we have the most advanced materials, engineering techniques, computer-assisted design that the world has ever seen. We could make the most beautiful buildings you ever saw, and with rare exceptions, we make the ugliest buildings you ever saw. But then there was this. Almost naked, a loose celebrity soiree at Moscow shocks the Russian soldiers in rat-infested trenches at the front. I don't know if it actually shocked them or not, but again, it was this thing about when people don't believe in anything, they seem to take their clothes off a lot. And then you also should get Satanism. And I heard this news story, I laugh at something horrible, but devil-worshipping Polish influencer Satan's doll charged with hacking parents to death with machete. And I filed this in my notes under, and nobody saw it coming. But this one I will try and, will I try and get this to play? I will try and get this to play. Because I like to let people speak in their own words before rubbishing them if I possibly can. That will depend if we get sound or not. Or a picture, or anything. No, it doesn't. Not his kind of science. Except you're like, okay, it doesn't mean anything. Luckily, life's short. He'll be dead soon. Phew. All right? It's like it's filmed in a church, but there's nothing, there's no there. There's no possibility. Flipboard sent me something, the search for a church that isn't a church from NPR. Or you get something about, this is the beginning of a news story. Citing religious rites and the dark prophecy of a terrible black snake that will bring harm to its people, a Sioux Indian tribe returned to court Tuesday in an 11th-hour push to keep the Dakota Access Pipeline from carrying its first crude oil. Did anybody involved in that story think the pipeline is the evil black snake of their mythology, so-called? No, of course not, right? But it doesn't, because there's no truth, you can say stuff like that. Only in a world where you really just don't believe it. And you get this, do what thou wilt, which of course comes from Gargantua and Pantagruel from the monastery, but was also big with Aleister Crowley. And again, you do what you wilt, and the problem is you're unhappy. And on and on and on it goes, and I flip through it all because I am trying not to torture you. Come on. I'm trying not to torture them, I said. You are what you eat, and then we're going to get lab-grown meat. Okay, I don't like the sound of that. And you get some of these sort of bellowing imbeciles, as John Lukács called them, who are saying, we're living in the best times ever, all the wealth, poverty eradicated. And the funny thing is, this stuff is true. Life expectancy increases, well, same-sex marriages, a woman in a hijab. But most of this stuff is true. But it seems to me it's largely beside the point. People aren't happier, right? The proportion of the population who are taking happy pills, if we may call them that, all of this stuff, people are not happier. And then I got this email about a tech show, and the big takeaway, we may not have our own flying cars yet, but at least we can talk to our faucets. And I thought, I was actually sitting at home saying to myself, what would bring true meaning into my life is if I could chat with a tap. What on earth? And then these robots, oh, we won't have to have human friends, right? And then the robots will take care of us, note our decline, and peacefully destroy us. And in the lecture, I talk a little bit about the fact that Western society, for all of this, does still do its very best to identify and fix its problems. And you don't always have to agree with the problems. Remember the George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter and so on. Perhaps in some ways, they'd gotten hold of the wrong end of what had really happened and its implications. But you did see a movement throughout Western society to say we must eliminate racial bigotry because racial bigotry is wrong. And that is true and noble, even if they sometimes flub the implementation. The West still believes certain things are wrong. And again, one of the things with my students at the beginning, I talk about slavery and say it's not likely that you meet moral relativists in Augustine College in the normal sense. When I taught in the secular university, of course, that's all you had. But I'd say, is there anybody here who does not believe that slavery is wrong? I don't just mean inconvenient and economically unproductive. I mean, just it's hideously wrong to treat a fellow human being as a thing. And they all think so, and then I say, well, here we go. I also point out to the students, one of the odd aspects of all of this is the Anglosphere keeps winning all the Nobel Prizes. It is absolutely astonishing the proportion of Nobel Prizes that are won by people in English-speaking countries, at least half of them people who came to English-speaking countries. So something's still going right. And then I had one of my identifiers was Anthony Bourdain, and I know nihil nisi bonum, but he was a celebrity chef, author, and travel documentarian. He starred in programs. He explored international culture, the human condition. And he seemed to have it all. And in one point, he talked about this defining moment. He was at a wedding party in a flounder and fried clam restaurant in Providence where he was washing dishes as a teenager. And he witnessed the bride sneak outside for an impromptu assignation with the chef and said, "I knew then, dear reader, for the first time I wanted to be a chef." And the news story said, the story captures Bourdain's conception of the cook's vocation as both seductively carnal and swaggeringly transgressive, end quote. And you presumably guess, if you didn't know, that the punchline is he then killed himself because this was an utterly miserable life that he was living. Or Sinead O'Connor, remember when she died? All the obituaries was like, hey, she ripped up a picture of the Pope. Yeah, you go, girl. And they didn't mention the fact that she'd converted to Islam, or that I gather she too had committed suicide. But some people would think it was important to the story. So, a lot of people have the sense that this isn't satisfactory. And this is just I get a lot of press releases for my sins, right? If I'm boring you, think what my workday's like. About all-party parliamentary group to end modern slavery and human trafficking is introducing the Modern Slavery Act. And I don't know what exactly the Modern Slavery Act is going to do, but clearly, the conscience of these people is in the right place. We ought not to be benefiting from slave labor. And yes, everything I own was made in China and ordered on Amazon, but in theory, we should not be doing this. And we're going to have to send a gunboat. And, we want to send a gunboat. Really, we're going to stamp out slavery just like they did in Victorian England. This was also... NBC sent me this thing here about black descendants of the Creek Nation trying to get citizenship in the tribe. And I was thinking, I shall enjoy watching them fight this out. But, all of this, for one thing, gives me grounds for hope that despite the power of these ideas, they can't get past that bedrock intuition that certain things are obviously wrong. That we have something to build on, and the reason we have something to build on, of course, is that there's a law written on the human heart. That all this philosophizing, and it is intelligent, and it is focused, and it is logical in its proceedings, but it isn't true that our brains are just tabula rasa, or a set of preformed ideas we can compare to nothing but preformed ideas. There is something we have access to that is real and true, and doesn't go away when you stop believing in it, and it's inside us where it needs to be. And for instance, this story, Gambia could become first to repeal ban on female genital cutting. And you know what? You are going to have to look long and hard for a multiculturalist who will defend that one. Again, as with slavery, there are certain things that everybody does in fact know are wrong. And that is actually good news. what's bad is that one of my kids got given this in school. So I said, everybody knows, and then I have to retract about half of public school teachers. Composers who identify as women. He? Right? Who in the canon, may I ask? There's also, I mean, you may have seen this cartoon. I think about this a lot when I see these young women with their expensive coffees and so on. But again, it's sort of noteworthy that people say that there's no such thing as beauty, and then these young women dress like they thought they were pretty, and everybody goes, oh, there's a pretty girl. But again, to me, the ultimate expression of the opposite is the Queers for Palestine. You couldn't have liberal death wish more prominently on display, but it was $1 million. This was it in a story published last year, which said, a watchdog organization has announced a provocative $1 million offer to any U.S. LGBTQ advocacy group willing to host a gay pride parade in Gaza or the West Bank, Fox News reported. The New Tolerance Campaign, NTC, says the initiative is designed to be a wake-up call to groups like Queers for Palestine that have emerged since the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel. And apparently, nobody has shown up. And so, in one sense, I've been trying not to dwell too much on what strikes me as a very obvious thing about this insolence of saying it's true that there's no truth. That's wrong. It blows itself up on the spot, or at least it should. And again, this is Poe's biographer of Lewis. All scientific knowledge depends upon the validity of reasoning. The reasoning of a person in a psychologically irrational state lacks validity and tends to be open to doubt by others. On this basis, Lewis proposed a rule. No thought is valid if it can be fully explained as a result of irrational causes. And since Darwinism, Marxism, Freudianism, and deconstructionism all explain themselves as the result of irrational causes, out they go. In that sense, we win the battle of ideas, it seems to me, without a whole lot of effort. And again, this is a line from G.K. Chesterton. It did for one wild moment cross my mind that perhaps those might not be the very best judges of the relation of religion to happiness, who by their own account had neither one nor the other. And I think that one might say the same thing about the relationship of religion to reason. Those who by their own admission have neither should not be trusted on the subject of which is which. And again, I find consolation in strange places like supermarket checkout lines because they keep running things like this. Generally around Christmas, who do men say that I am, right? You can't look away. National Geographic. Wait, the tomb of Jesus is how old? Because they were astonished to discover that the tomb of Jesus apparently dates to the time of Jesus. But they did admit it. And that to me, that is again, is a positive thing in all of this. And then they do a thing on the women in Christianity. And again, one of the things I've noticed reading the Old Testament, it dawned on me about the 17th time through it, is that it is extraordinary in the attention it gives to women. The Old Testament names specific women, describes their actions, and treats them as important in a way that you do not find in other mythologies. You go through Greek and Roman mythology looking for any story about a real, actual woman who mattered. And so people keep doing that. Of course, people also keep writing stories like this one. These wild Cardi B outfits prove her style is truly unmatched, which is a bit like Dreyfus's verdict on Clouseau, that he's an extraordinary man. It also reminded me of a story from Peter Jacobson, who was a professional golfer and a very funny guy. And at one point, he ran into Fuzzy Zeller, who had won the Continental. I can't remember what the name of it was. I think something beginning with C, maybe Continental. He'd won a fairly prestigious golf tournament where you get a red plaid jacket. And so Jenkinson greeted him with, "Hey, Fuzz, great jacket. What did you do? Shoot a couch?" Jacobson said then the next year he won it, the Colonial, that's what it was. He said he won it the next year, and then he said suddenly the jacket looked rather more stylish to him. But honestly, does she not look like she shot a couch? Or a rug or something, anyway. And nobody can really pretend that look is anything. And indeed, speaking of old writers, though not Locke, Berkeley, or Hume, I allow that if no supreme ruler exists, wise to form and potent to enforce the moral law, there is no sanction to any contract, virtual or even actual, against the will of prevalent power. On that hypothesis, let any set of men be strong enough to set their duties at defiance, and they cease to be duties any longer. So in one way, the stakes have been as clear from the 18th century as the arguments have on that one side. And the point is, of course, as I've been saying about evil and so on, that everybody knows certain things are wrong. So confronted with what Burke has said here, if there is no truth, there can be no moral law, but we all know there's a moral law. Really, everybody knows that, even when we disagree so dramatically about what it says. The number of people in this world who actually affirm and act as though there was no such thing as right and wrong is vanishingly small. So in that sense, we can win the battle of ideas by starting, as Johnson said, by reminding people, rather than confronting them with something novel, reminding them that there are things they think are wrong. And that means there is right and wrong, that means there is moral truth, that means there is truth, and then we can start trying to figure out how on earth it can be that for all that is right in Locke, Berkeley, or Hume, for all that is right in Darwin, or even some insights in Marx, Freud not so much, despite all of this, there are things that really are true. But I believe at the same time, in doing this, the critical thing is you always have to take a stand. Suaviter in modo, fortiter in re. When people say there's no truth, we must never allow that statement to go unchallenged, because that is what has swept everything away and brought us to the brink of disaster. And as we sit there, one foot in the grave and the other over the abyss, I think I probably ended with this before. I certainly end the course with it. Christianity always rises again because it has a God who knows the way out of the grave. Thank you. How long was that? Oh dear, how long? It could have been worse, and next time it probably will be.
And I asked them, did you read the 5th chapter? And the 5th chapter is about sexuality in infants, babies, and children all the way into the teen years. And I recommend you read it. And when you read it, you realize, in order to come to this conclusion, they have abused thousands of children. There is no other way to come to that conclusion. And they actually say, oh, when these children have these experiences that they often start crying, and that breaks your heart, because they were raping children as young as little babies. And the fellow who did this, mostly, was a young pedophile. And Kinsey said, I'm very sorry, I can't mention you, give you an honorable mention, because that's not possible in our society. But they don't read chapter 5. They read about the homosexuality that's more prominent, as is generally believed. And that's probably true, I believe that actually, but it's certainly true that it's skewed if you go to interview people in male jails that have been, there for 10 years, right? Yeah, it's a horrible book. It's a horrible man. I mean, he had a horrible life. A complete deviant fellow who had no moral compass at all. And yet there is a Kinsey Institute with a big statue wherever he lived in the States. Yeah. And the guy should have been in jail many times over. It's just not believable that anybody can actually still, defend this thing.
Yeah, and you still come across favorable references to him and how this is sort of the enlightened view of sexuality versus all those Christian fuddy-duddies. And it is astounding because, it's trivial compared to what you just said, but his statistical samples were badly skewed, obviously. The kinds of subjects that he interviewed were not people with typical sex lives. But in some sense, people wanted to believe it. He came along at a propitious time for himself, right? And people embraced it as an excuse to start behaving very, very badly. And in a culture that, for some reason or another, was ready for that in a way that it would not have been even 40 years earlier. But at the same time, and it seems to me that if you can get people to understand what you just said, then 99.99% of them will turn against Kinsey. Maybe not right away, people are logical solely, but I think that when you realize that his experiments did that to innocent babies, it's hard to find a worse thing in this world than child molestation, right? It really is the and so again, it's funny in a way that in one sense our arguments are so strong, but in another sense we're doing very badly. So obviously the other side's arguments have a great deal of power as well. We must not underestimate our opponents, but we must also not despair. We must understand that in the universe is not so constructed that evil shall triumph in the end, and that we really can stop this, especially, as I say, I think it's why I wasted an hour and a half of your life with only about 6 jokes, if we see where the problem is coming from and what it is that we're fighting against. Because if you don't know what you're fighting against, you may have trouble fighting it effectively. But it can be beaten. Well, you're most welcome. We will retire for casual conversation, or in my case, a brief chat and then a dog walk. Because I have a moral duty to this dog. You may say it's just a dog, but we have a covenant with this dog. We have taken it into our home, promising that it shall be looked after as it deserves, and it would be wrong. Again, I think actually because animal cruelty, I remember one time I was doing a seminar on slavery at the University of Ottawa, and I said to the students that it was sobering to reflect on how many people didn't see the evil of slavery in their time. We all think we'd have been abolitionists, but statistically we wouldn't. And so you think about what will we in the modern day wonder how we could have missed. And I brought up abortion, of course. And then one of the students said, what about cruelty to animals? And I thought to myself, okay, it may not be top of my list, but I'm certainly very much against it. And again, it's a way into the question, is there such a thing as right and wrong? Is it just wrong to torture a cat? And if you can get someone to concede that point, in a way, you've got them. It's a small crack, and it'll take some wiggling, but you've got them.
I think you had your friend, when she said appropriate. It's probably not appropriate to torture a cat either.
I think it is not.
You had her because appropriate is teleological language, right? I mean, it's appropriate to a purpose, right? Your sexuality, it's inappropriate for the purposes of sexuality, right? So, I mean, they will make these language mistakes because they can't help themselves. You know what I mean? It's just like function. I mean, they'll use the word, this functions. Well, what functions according to a purpose? You know what I mean? They can't help themselves. And you can say.
Because reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. The metaphysical structure of reality is not a construct of the human mind. It's real. God made the universe this way and not some other way. And so that's why you run into that.
A materialist gastroenterologist who, doesn't believe in purposes, uses well, it just functions this way. What do you mean it functions this way?
Yeah.
What are you talking about? It's all across.
It's very difficult to talk to postmodernists because we see everything in the paradigm of power. And as soon as you talk, you have a certain power position in the hierarchy of power or the hierarchy of victimhood, which is all the same thing, wherever, depending where you step on the train. And that determines whether you're worth talking to, and whether what you're saying is not terribly suspect, because if you have exposed more privilege or power, you have to suspect. Be suspicious of whatever you say.
Yeah, I mean, they're powerful ideas, right? There is a logic to these things. They're not utterly whimsical. I mean, I always thought with a deconstructionist, the best way to test the meaning of text is to stop paying them according to their contract. But of course, they'd say, well, that's just a power play. And then you wind up like Mussolini. Well, okay, you must not. But again, yeah, nobody said the job would be easy. I think I've mentioned it's a Herman cartoon that I have at various times set up at my desk of a Pony Express rider, and he's leaning over the desk at his boss. He's got 3 arrows sticking out of his back, and the boss is going, "Nobody said the job was going to be easy." Anyway, yeah, let's converse casually here rather than me blabbing on.